one of my favorite guests is Ghenis from the UBI Center, because this man always comes with charts, and you know how much we love those on this channel. So we're going to catch up on the latest UBI research. We'll talk about an analysis of Andrew Yang's plan for New York City. And then we'll take some audience questions. But before we get into that, let's warm it up. There's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Pain, dang, is in. Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Pain, dang, is in. Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang. Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds.
Max, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Yeah, can't complain. How have you been?
It's been a long time. I guess the last time you were on, we're probably in the middle of the third surge of our lovely COVID pandemic, and now we're entering a new Delta era. But tell me a little bit about what's been going on with the UBI Center. I know, sounds like you guys have been doing great work. What's the latest?
Yeah, we've been definitely keeping busy. We've been doing a lot more stuff in the UK as well as on the US, building more technologies to enable people to understand the impact of UBI and UBI type policies. And we're actually gearing up there's a Basic Income Earth Network conference at the end of this month, actually just 10 days from now. So we've got a few papers going there where we're talking a little bit more about our UK work. But I think it's just a really important, exciting time with the child tax credit expansions. And I mean, it's obviously really uncertain with COVID, but I think it's a good time for unconditional cash transfer policy.
What's going on in the UK? Is there a growing interest in basic income over there? Or I hadn't heard about that in the past.
Yeah, so I would say the UK UBI might be more popular there than anywhere else I'm aware of. So something like 70% of the public support it, and not very many oppose it. In theory, obviously, gets a little tricky once you get into the financing. But there's been interest from the Liberal Democrats Party and the Green Party. So the Labour Party and the Conservatives haven't taken a stance on it yet. Those are the two big ones. But, Lib Dems, they have a few MPs, and they officially endorsed UBI about a year ago, and now they're in the process of crafting their specific policy that they want. There's also a big pilot that's scheduled for Wales. So the details of that are still a bit uncertain too. But I think there's a lot of local councillors and local politicians and lots of different folks in national government who are very warm to the idea.
How are they planning on funding it?
Well, so the parties have come out with it, like the Green Party, the Lib Dems. They've talked about a few potential reforms. So, for example, the Lib Dems put out a policy paper, which wasn't an endorsement yet, but they laid out, for example, removing what's called the personal allowance in the UK, or shrinking it to some degree. And that's kind of like our standard deduction. So it's basically a way to broaden the tax base. And the Green Party did something pretty similar. So one of my colleagues actually just a couple weeks ago did a paper on what happens if you fully repeal the personal allowance there, and the poverty rate would fall like 30% if you repeal that and then put the money into a UBI. And we have some interactive graphics where you can say, like, if you don't want to repeal it fully, you just want to repeal part of it, you can drag the amount of the standard deduction or personal allowance. So I think that's probably going to be the biggest single policy that has come out for it. There have been people who've talked about like land value tax as well. I I think the Wales pilot, they really haven't talked about because it's just a pilot, how they're going to fund it.
So has anybody in the UK talked about a carbon tax as a source of funding, or?
Yeah. And that's actually something we're working on now, is assessing that. But there have been some other researchers who have done it too. And yeah, I think a couple of years ago, there was a paper in the UK showing how roughly the bottom, I think 6 or 7 deciles come out ahead and from a carbon dividend. And I think it's a really important policy for the US to embrace as well, because we're one of the few. The UK does have a carbon pricing system right now, so that could transition to a carbon dividend. But the US, it's really just the US and Australia of major developed countries that don't have a carbon pricing system. So it's a big opportunity for us.
What's the difference between a carbon tax and a carbon dividend?
Carbon dividend is just using all that revenue from the carbon tax to fund a small UBI.
Got it. So it's a carbon UBI. It's a UBI funded by a carbon tax. That's the carbon dividend. Okay. And I'm in the middle of reading Bill Gates's book about climate change.
Me too.
And it is incredible how detailed he gets with all of the facts and figures, and how far behind, like how much we have to go to actually get to a carbon neutral world. It does feel like, wouldn't it be great if you could eradicate poverty and kind of provide the right incentives to transition to renewable energy at the same time through a carbon tax? But I guess the problem, or one of the risks, would be as you get better at generating energy through other means, then you're lowering the supply of those carbon dividend dollars, right?
Yeah, so there's a policy, I think the only true carbon dividend that's been proposed in the US is called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And that has about 80 co-sponsors in the House. It sets a price of $15 per ton plus $10 every year. So it goes up to 25, 35, et cetera. And the modeling there suggests that for the first 8 or 9 years, the dividend amount is going to go up every year. And then it starts to decline. So basically, there's 2 competing forces. You've got the rising price, but you've also got the lowering emissions. So over time, and then you get to net zero by 2050. So I think imagine a decade of a dividend every single month, and it keeps going up every year. I think that would build pretty unprecedented political momentum for UBI, which would be hard to start eating away at. I think we would supplement the revenue with some other source at that point.
Yeah. And then in the case of industries that are very carbon dependent, at least they would have some floor. You know, if you're a coal miner in West Virginia and you at least had a carbon dividend, like maybe there aren't as many coal mining jobs, but at least you have something to kind of help you transition to, and help your kids kind of find other pursuits as well. I noticed that you guys had published a article about the carbon dividend as an anti-poverty measure. Shall we throw up the first chart?
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right. Let's see here. I think this is the right one. Whoops, I'm zoomed out too much. Is this the article? Yeah, I know. Is this the right article?
Yeah. This is our latest article.
So what's the most interesting stuff that we should focus on for this one?
Well, there's only 4 charts here, so we can probably just breeze through the first couple.
Yeah. Okay.
Basically, what I did was simulated a variety of carbon dividend policies. And these are the absolute simplest carbon dividend you can kind of imagine. So you assess the price, and then the entire revenue goes to every single person, children and adults equally, and the dividend is not taxed. So that's a little bit different from the Energy Innovation Act, which gives half a credit for kids, and also the dividend itself is taxed. And there's another bill in Congress called the Save Our Future Act, where only part of the revenue goes to the dividend, and the dividend actually phases out with income. So this is like a very simple way of doing it. And roughly for every $10 per ton, so that's the way that carbon taxes are assessed per metric ton of carbon emissions, you get a dividend of about $13 for. So that's kind of what this chart shows. And you can hover over the line if you want to see some values.
All right, let's see. So if you charge a carbon price of $35 per ton, then each adult would get $44 per month?
Every adult and child.
Oh, and child. Okay,
yeah.
Got it. And then what does that look like for the business that currently is fueled by carbon producing energy? How much of an impact to their bottom line does that $35 per ton price translate to? Like let's say you're you're in manufacturing and you have to power the machines in your factory, and currently they're powered by coal power plants. What does that do to my business if I'm running that business?
Yeah, there's been only one study that I found that's looked at this rigorously recently, and what they've looked at is basically what share of the carbon tax would be passed on to consumers compared to what share would be borne by the producers. And basically they find that about 70% of the price is passed on to consumers and 30% is borne by the producers. So, this would, by design, make it harder for carbon dependent firms to really succeed. It would encourage them to move toward more clean production practices. And the way it works is it's taxed at the source. So it levies a fee on the oil well, on the coal mine, the fracking site, and also at the border. So if you're bringing in steel from China or something like that, then depending on the carbon pricing system of that country, China, compared to ours, we would levy an additional fee on that. So that makes our domestic producers competitive with foreign producers. So yeah, it could come at some cost, and actually that makes it more progressive than even I modeled. The simplest way to do this kind of modeling is just assuming 100% pass through. So it's going to be more progressive when you only assume a partial pass through, because people who hold that kind of equity in those companies tend to be richer.
Right. So let's say in our the $44 monthly dividend, is that net of the increased prices that the consumer will need to pay for some of their stuff, or is that what you're saying?
No. So this is the dividend, and then you'd subtract that. So if we showed that chart, it would just be zero, because this is fully budget neutral. So on average, this would not affect anyone any way or the other. But it turns out that the net effect is pretty progressive, because people who are poorer consume less carbon than richer people.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, let's move on to the next chart.
Okay, yeah. So this is where it gets interesting. I think I start to do what you were just asking about, which is subtract the carbon emissions, basically how much people actually bear of the carbon tax, compare that to the dividend, and see when you add the dividend minus carbon tax, how does people net income come out? And this ends up reducing poverty quite a bit. So roughly it's linear. You see here, every $10 per ton carbon price is going to reduce the poverty rate by about 1%. So if we had $100 a ton carbon price, that's reducing poverty by 10%. So that's like several million people lifted out of poverty.
And how do we even think about that $100 per ton price? Is that a rounding error for a business, or is it like they're going to double their costs? Like what are the typical carbon prices that people pay in other countries?
Well, one benchmark is looking at gas prices. So I think a $10 per ton carbon price translates to about 9-cent increase to each gallon of gas.
Oh,
so
yeah, that's not
$100 a ton is about just short of $1 per gallon.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's Well, coming from having lived 4 years in Switzerland where we paid through the nose for gas, like
Right.
that's nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Wow. So you add a few bucks a gallon and you can drop a couple dollars a gallon. You can drop poverty by maybe 10%.
Yeah.
Wow.
No, less than $1 per gallon. Yeah.
Less than $1, you can drop it by 10%. So then if you did $2, then you could drop it by 20%.
Yeah.
Wow.
At a certain point, you hit diminishing returns, but up to about $200, you don't. So, $100 a ton, the Energy Innovation Act would hit $100 a ton within a decade by 2030. And we haven't talked about the climate impact, but over a decade, we would cut emissions in half if we implemented this policy. So, and also over a decade, it's projected that a policy like that would avert about 300,000 deaths from air pollution. So this is like a win-win-win policy.
Yeah. So like $100 per ton, or call it $1 per gallon. Would that get us actually beyond what we've committed to for the Paris climate accords? It sounds like did you say cut it in half in 10 years?
Yeah, so that's the goal that's been set by Biden.
Right.
And, net zero by 2050, that's the big goal that IPCC has encouraged, and they would achieve that.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm guessing the counterpoint will be, hey, people are struggling to fill up their tanks at the current prices. Now you're going to add more. But I guess they're getting it back, right? Like, or by definition, if they're struggling and the poverty rate's coming down, the people that are going to be quote unquote hurt are the people that fly around in jets all the time and are rich, basically.
Yeah, about 2/3 of people would come out ahead on that basis from these kinds of carbon dividend policies. So, that top third, they're not all millionaire jet setters, but a lot of them wouldn't be impacted all that much, and it would encourage them to reduce their carbon footprint to some degree too.
Yeah. I guess also if you have a car that is highly inefficient, then that's a choice, people can reconsider. Like, do you really need the V10, kind of drag racer?
Yeah, I think it would maybe reduce some of the noise in my neighborhood from the loud trucks and stuff. So that would be another side benefit.
Yeah. I was actually coming back from the airport yesterday, and the Uber driver asked about an SUV that we have in the driveway, and he said, "Oh, what kind of mileage do you get?" And I was so embarrassed to tell him, like, it's terrible mileage. And he's like, "Yeah, that would never." Cause he's driving like a hybrid vehicle, and it gets like 50 miles a gallon, and our SUV does not do that.
Well, but I think it does get to an interesting point, which is like, there's been a study from the Columbia Center on Poverty and Social Policy, and they've basically been arguing, they did some simulations showing that giving the full credit to kids is a stronger anti-poverty measure than giving a half credit to kids or none to kids. Because I don't know, like, I don't have an SUV, but I don't have kids. And I think it's really a lot harder. I mean, parents need more space. They need more bedrooms in their home. They need larger vehicles when they have vehicles. So I do think I'll give you a bit of a pass because I know you've got some kids. So
I do have kids. I will say this though, when we were picking the car, we didn't really strongly consider the mileage. Because we're like, oh, well, we want, safety. We want it to be a good looking car. We want it to have enough space to kind of lug the kids and the dog and their friends around. But I don't remember in our table of, comparisons like, oh, well, what's the MPG? And the reason was like, it doesn't hurt us that much to have a 22 mile per gallon car versus a 40 mile per gallon car. Like, but if the carbon taxes were more, then I think we would be like, wait, hold on a second. At least should we consider, do we really need all a 3-row SUV?
Yeah.
And second, if we do have a 3-row SUV, should we think about either a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid or fully electric? And that it never mattered because the gas is so cheap here in the US versus what we're used to paying in Europe. So I think people, even if they have, we consider ourselves pretty progressive people, but like you react to the incentives, the economic incentives. And right now the system is set up that you can consume a lot of carbon fuels and not really have to pay that much more for the privilege of doing that. So people do it. All right, let's move on to the next chart.
Okay, yeah. So this one, I was kind of talking about this before, but it turns out that when you have a policy like this, it's going to have even bigger effects on kids and even bigger effects on deep poverty. So that's the share of people who are below half the poverty line. And that kind of makes sense because when you give money to everyone, the people who are really going to benefit the most from it are those who are just extremely poor. It's a larger percentage increase for them. So roughly the rule of thumb I found is that $10 per ton carbon price, that's going to reduce the overall poverty rate by 1%, but it's going to reduce the child poverty rate by about 2%, and it's going to reduce the deep child poverty rate by almost 3%, so about 2.7%.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's the one thing that I think a lot of people either overlook is that if you really care deeply about poverty, there are ways to address it. Like by definition, how poverty is calculated is by income. So if you have a basic income, that's the fastest. Like, yes, of course, you want to do stuff around Head Start and preschool and more money for college if that's what people want to pursue. But that's not going to affect the people that are in poverty like this year kind of thing. Those are longer term, long burn kind of investments. And with, we could debate the efficiency of those things. But this is clearly reducing deep child poverty by 25%. Is that that's assuming the $100, the $1 a gallon equivalent.
Yeah, so you can drag that slider to see how it changes.
Yeah.
But yeah, and in terms of future investment too, the child poverty, there's just so much research on how that improves future outcomes as well. I love it. There's just a study, I think, in particular when the child is really young, like that first year of life. If you can eradicate poverty at that first year, you're going to improve educational outcomes. There was just a study showing that it improves earnings by like your 20s even. So that's going to really pay for itself quickly.
All right. Now the next article.
Okay. I'm sorry. I know we're a bit short of time, but I just wanted to show people the map, which is the very last chart in the carbon dividend.
Okay, hold on. Let me pull that one back up. The carbon dividend. Oh, this is the map of the country, right? Okay,
yeah.
Let me pull that up. Hold on. Share. Boom. Chrome tab. I believe it's this one. Oh, maybe it's not. Hold on. Is it this guy?
Yeah. So I'm in California, and basically this shows that the poverty impact is positive in 49 out of 50 states. So the only state that it doesn't reduce poverty is North Dakota. They have very high carbon footprints, and they also have very low poverty. So it slightly increases their poverty, but they're still well below the national poverty average. And then states like California, we have next to New York and DC, the lowest per capita carbon emissions. So we actually have the highest poverty impact from a carbon dividend. It goes, instead of $100 a ton, you're looking at 14% poverty reduction instead of 10%. So
Yeah. So for a state that doesn't produce a lot of carbon or consume a lot of carbon, then you win because your kids are getting the carbon dividend, but you're not paying as much in carbon taxes because your state doesn't consume a lot of carbon. If
Yep.
you're up in North Dakota and you are consuming a lot of carbon and then you don't have that many kids in poverty, then that's kind of a net loss for you. So I guess it's a good incentive for a state to be more carbon efficient.
Mhm.
Yeah, makes a ton
Yeah.
of sense.
So, and this ties in with maybe something else we'll look at, but what we're really hoping to do is to empower people to understand in their increasingly local area what the impacts of UBI policies are. Because I think that's really where it comes down to politics. You can actually reach out to your senator or your member of Congress if you're so inclined and just share this information with them. If you want to support a policy, you would be more able to do that. So if anyone has other ideas or things that they'd like to know about how UBI affects their local communities, feel free to let us know. And we're really interested in moving more in that direction.
Yeah, the other thing is even in the Southeast, the kind of traditionally red states, they all benefit in terms of reduction in child poverty with a carbon tax or carbon pricing. Cool. All right. Now, I saw an article on the UBI Center. By the way, everybody should just Google UBI Center and favorite it and bookmark it. But I saw you have a newsletter. So sign up for that. But we have something about Ilhan Omar's near UBI bill. So I want to get into that. But before we do that, we have to thank some of the people who make this channel possible. So I'm going to quickly give some shout outs to our members. So give me 1 second. So we're going to start out with our highest level member, Soldier One. Thank you for your support, Soldier One, as a senior vice president. And then next, we're going to go to our VP level. That's Kristen Slevin, Laura Lane, Patrick Dunn, Richard Johnson, and Bike. And then we're going to go next to our hardcore level. Mike, Gene, David, DK, Phoenix, Jekalego, Kirsch, Mr. History, Byron, Mona, Susan, Yang, Tony, Robert, Dean, Statnerd, Galessa, Jay Perrin, AA, Jay Bryan, Vivian, Dana, Flavio, Yoda, Jason, and Parth. And then at our entry level, we want to thank V, Helen, Lisa, Sugar, Albert, Brandon, Brian, Peter, Arez, Your Maman, Sophia, Jadwiga, Shake and Make, Mike, Doris, Emerald, Lori, Ben, Roger, Lisa, Christina, Vaughn, Rasta, Jessica, Elizabeth, James, Emma, Hui, Ira, Shoni, Philip, Jameson, Dr. William, Karen, Monica, Mai, Ardent, Semery, David, Brittany, Sasha, Juana, Warren, Reddy, Lucky, and Kevin. So thank you to all of our members who make this content possible. Now we're going to get into Ilhan Omar's near UBI guarantee, which I am not familiar with. So I'm super excited to kind of learn about this. I haven't read about it much in the press. So maybe we'll start with a little background, and then if there's some charts, we can get into those. What is this act even about?
Yeah, so this is basically two pieces in one act. And there's a second sort of companion bill that defined kind of a new poverty measure, but really focusing in on the Support Act, which Ilhan Omar, Pramila Jayapal, Cory Bush, and a couple others co-sponsored. What this does is it, first of all, funds pilots of guaranteed income programs across the country, $500 million per year over 5 years. So that's $5 billion total. 2.5 billion total. And then it also, starting in 2028, it creates this new guaranteed income tax credit, which is not a full UBI, but compared to other guaranteed income proposals, it's pretty close to UBI. So for example, over 99% of people would get some benefit from it. It does phase out with higher incomes, so they're not all getting the full benefit. But this would start creating monthly payments to the vast majority of the country. It does not have any funding mechanism attached to it. So I think that's, that is an important piece, I think.
Do you know how much the guaranteed income tax credit, like how much it would be, like what the benefits would be?
Yeah, so we estimated, this is a paper with my colleague Nate Golden, and we estimated that the cost would be 3.75 trillion per year.
Whoa.
That might actually be lower in 2028 because all the amounts are nominal. So like the phase out threshold, those don't change with inflation until 2028. And we would expect that people would get richer by then. But it'll definitely be over 3 trillion a year.
Wow. Have you seen much coverage of this? Like, I don't feel like I've heard much about it on, the newspapers or on social media.
I've seen some coverage. I think more from like Fox News probably than other sources, because it's just
because it's Ilhan Omar.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. They need a villain to kind of talk about. The 500 million in grants should be totally fundable. I mean, that's a drop in our federal budget kind of bucket. And that would be pretty amazing. Local guaranteed income pilot programs.
Yeah. I guess I feel like the programs we've seen so far have been pretty successful. They've mostly mirrored the studies we've seen from other kinds of programs. Another 5 years seems excessive to me to wait before implementing an actual policy. And also, it's just a huge jump from $500 million in 2027 to 3 trillion in 2028. It's a big change.
Why not? And I know many of my progressive friends will say, "Oh, Tom, he's such a moderate." But why not have a more gradual? Why not go for a guaranteed income tax credit that costs, let's say, $1 trillion and not 3 trillion? Like, why go from 500 million in grants to a $3 trillion annual bill?
It's a good question.
Yeah. I guess maybe this is the negotiation part. This is the opening offer.
But I think that's where a carbon dividend comes in as a nice bridge to these bigger policies, because once you have the carbon dividend, it's not something we talked about, but it forces you to build the infrastructure to send payments to every person in the country.
Right.
You can then, if you have some extra money in the budget, or if you want to create some new tax that you can phase in over time, and you want to use some money for guaranteed income, you can leverage that.
Okay, so it would be $1,200 a month for single file. So it's it's almost like, over $1,000 a month for the lower income folks. And then the annual payment is reduced by $5 per 100 in excess. So for example, income of 100K, would still get $13,000 a year. Is that right? If so it's not some cliff where once you get a good job, you lose all the stuff. So that's kind of nice.
Yeah, I think this is an important difference with other guaranteed income proposals, which phase out at a faster rate. Partially because also like the people who would be hit by this phase out threshold, this one starts phasing out a bit higher. So those are the two big differences. First of all, it's the full amount until a fairly high income, 75K, that's above the median household income.
Yeah.
So about 70% of people would get the entire value. And then it phases out slowly. So it's not discouraging work too much, because this basically adds a 5% marginal tax rate above incomes in that threshold range.
Well, yeah, that's who would have thought that Ilhan Omar is a big UBI guy? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, she came up with it was like $1 trillion coin. I think it was a $2,000 a month pandemic payments
Uh-huh.
was also
Uh-huh.
her proposal.
Jay Parent is saying, hey, where does the money come from? She does not propose where it's funded. I guess this is where we could speculate, well, maybe a carbon tax, maybe higher more progressive income tax or something, or VAT, I suppose.
Yeah, this would be very difficult to fund because it's so expensive. So
Yeah.
Roughly, you could probably do it if you had something like a 40% value added tax. That would be higher.
Ooh.
Right now, the highest in the world is 28%.
Yeah.
You could, if you wanted to boost the personal income tax rates by 30 percentage points, 35 percentage points, you could start to get there. But this would be an extraordinarily expensive program.
Yeah. 40%'s kind of hard to swallow. But if it were like a 10 to 15% VAT, and you could still get $300 a month, I mean, that would still have a huge impact on poverty. It would definitely be meaningful help. And, frankly, it would also probably reduce our excess consumption of things.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is starting high for sure. $1,200 a month, $2,400 a month for joint filers, and it doesn't drop until you get to 75K, and even then, it only drops at a 5% marginal rate. Like, this is an extremely generous program. So, like, even if you got a third of what's being proposed here, it still would be meaningful. Yeah.
Andrew Yang, he proposed a 10% VAT. I think that's a really good place for us to start. It's on the low side compared to other countries, but pair that with a carbon tax and some other income tax reform, and you can start to get some real big programs.
Totally.
So this is just a diagram of how the phase out structure works. So you can see that there is this table. So you basically get the full amount up to a certain income level, and then it phases out at 5%, which means like individuals still get a non-zero amount, even if they have no kids. If their income is about 400K, that's where it starts to phase out fully. And if you're a married filer with some kids, you can actually earn up to $1 million and still get something.
Wow. Super generous.
Yeah.
And then this is, I can drag this for the dependents. So if I have 2 kids, wow. Yeah. I mean, this is like the original Biden infrastructure proposal where they started at like 4 trillion. Yeah. And then they negotiated down to whatever we're at now. But good for Congressional Representative Omar. I love it.
So the rest of the paper really just shows that effectively it ends poverty entirely. There's a little bit of poverty left because some people have negative income. So even if you gave everyone like twice this, you would still have some lingering poverty. And then depending on the metric, it would also reduce inequality pretty dramatically. Between 20 and 30%.
Love it. Yeah. So what's your conclusion? What's your takeaway from this effort? Do you think it's going to go anywhere?
I don't know. I think it's so big that it risks being, just kind of disregarded because it's so unrealistic. And I don't know. It could. For example, California, we did actually pass a bill that would create more revenue for or more funding for guaranteed income pilots in California. So you could envision this doing the same thing at the national scale. Whether that's what we need compared to a policy that starts small and starts giving everybody a certain amount of money. I think, for example, the child tax credit, the relief payments, those have been more effective at changing perceptions of UBI. This is my speculation, but I think that's been more effective than the pilots have been. So I would prefer we move that direction.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is, how amazing is it that you basically have a high profile member of the Democratic Party, a clearly associated with like the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, advocating what is very close, as you call it, a near UBI proposal. I mean, that's kind of amazing. That I don't know that we would have imagined that to happen, 2 years ago. That's incredible.
Yeah, and it is a big difference from in the past where folks like her would be more on the job guarantee side or something like that. I think this does create a bit more of an opening to get those kind of progressives on board with something that could be a smaller guarantee, an actual policy.
Have you seen anyone in the Republican Party get behind near UBI or UBI programs? I mean, I always find it so strange that Republicans aren't more in favor of this kind of thing, given their general distrust of large like government bureaucracies and spending programs.
Well, Milton Friedman was a big advocate of it back in the day. Mitt Romney has been supportive of carbon dividends. There have been other conservatives who have supported carbon dividend policy. Aside, and I guess like the child allowance too. I think there is a clear comparison between a child allowance and child care subsidies, and their conservatives are pretty on board with giving cash instead. So,
yeah, I mean, Milton Friedman, Mitt Romney, I don't think they're considered Republicans today.
Yeah,
right. They would be called rhinos, ironically, but they would be by today's party membership. They would think more of the thought leaders would be like a Marjorie Taylor Greene or that whole crowd. And I haven't heard the Trump folks talk about it, but maybe they have. Maybe
even some of those have been. I mean, Trump put 2 of these relief payments into place, and I think he saw that was a pretty good strategy. He wasn't alone. Other Republicans also have credited him with those kind of policies. So
maybe there's hope. All right. Now, last thing I want to talk about is the child allowance. So let me pull up one of those. I'm in a full screen.
Apologies in advance if it crashes your computer.
This
is a big map.
Okay, hold on a second. Boom. Okay.
Cool.
I think I can see most of it. Yeah. I see a lot of features here. I'm not sure what I should click on.
This is really just so this is basically what we did is we simulated $100 per month child allowance. So I think this is a nice policy because it's very bite-sized. Here in California, this would be a roughly $11 billion program, which is about 5% of the current state budget. So we could fit that in, and it would have enormous anti-poverty impacts on child poverty, kind of in every part of the country, even though there's some heterogeneity. So this is looking at this is actually upper state legislative districts. So like in California, that would be the Senate. I think a lot of states call it the Senate, and you can kind of see the impact every district there.
Yeah. So basically, if you are a state that has children, and there's some significant amount of poverty from families with children, then you're going to see benefits, whether you're a coal miner in West Virginia or you're in Western Pennsylvania or you're in California. It's kind of addressing it equally. Although it does seem like parts of the Great Lakes benefit even more. What's going on there? Is just a lot of large impoverished families there? Is that?
I think the main driver is housing costs. So this sort of goes against the carbon dividend in some ways. Like California has very high housing costs, so you're not going to reduce poverty as much compared to these lower cost areas.
Cool. Let me see if there's anything else on this child. It feels like an unsung accomplishment. The last stimulus had some significant child tax credits, right?
Yeah.
And like nobody talks about that. What is that all about? Like, wasn't that historic? Like, what happened?
It was very historic. I don't know. Maybe my feed is too tailored to me. I do see a lot of coverage of it. I think we've only had one payment so far. So the first payment was, I think, July 15th. We'll have one a week from today, I guess, is the next one. And what that did is a couple things. The first is it increased the total payment size of the child tax credit. Usually that's an annual credit. And this basically increased it to $250 a month for kids 6 to 17 and $300 a month for kids 0 to 5. And it made it monthly, and probably most importantly for poverty impact, it made it what's called fully refundable. So the existing child tax credit, if you don't owe money to the federal government because you don't have high enough income, you don't get the full value of the credit. So this makes sure that kids in the deepest poverty are eligible for it. Now, I think we still have to see how much of an actual poverty impact this is going to be rather than theoretical, because the problem is still that you have to effectively file taxes to get it. And the IRS has established a tool which, if you don't have a net income tax liability, you can have a simplified process for getting the credit. But this website to request the child tax credit is awful. It's not mobile optimized at all. It's not a .gov website. It's like this separate freefillableforms.com thing that the government contracted out.
Oh my God. It probably looks like a scam.
It does. Yeah. So I think this is really where the idea of UBI being universal is not just a theoretical advantage. It's the kind of thing where if it's universal, you can do it through the Social Security Administration. You don't have to go through the IRS, the whole tax system. There's no reason. I mean, SSA does not exclude people to the very large degree. I think they're expecting that something like half of kids in poverty are not going to receive the benefit because we're just not going to be able to get them the information to reach them. I think universality, it wouldn't have cost all that much more to make this program universal. And I think it's something the government should really consider for the next round if they want to make it permanent. Yeah.
I mean, if it's a childhood tax credit, like why not use the public schools as a way to distribute it, right? Like
a lot of them are closed. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good idea. I hope in the future we can do that.
Yeah. Here's a question from the audience from Jay Perrin. Any data on how the child tax credit is being spent? Like, what are people doing with the money?
I don't know if we have enough yet for this specific one. There is some research. So there's kind of two areas of research. One is just if you relieve poverty among children, what's the impact of that? And the impact is very positive. I mentioned before, it sort of improves educational outcomes, nutrition, health, long-term earnings, even longer-term life expectancy all improve as a result of reducing child poverty. So that does indicate that parents are spending the money productively on the kids. Otherwise, you wouldn't have those kinds of advantages. And that's true across developed and developing countries. There was an interesting study about 2 years ago in Canada, in Vancouver, where they gave some money to people experiencing homelessness. And by far, they had a control group and stuff. So by far, the biggest areas where consumption rose were on their kids. So they spent more on kids' food, clothing, shelter, those kinds of things. And this also, so that's sort of one area of research. The other one shows that there's called like a labeling effect. So if you say on the transfer, it's not just an amount, this is actually for your kids, they're going to spend it more on kids. So there's sort of a behavioral economics effect there. It's, I think, smaller than just the effect of making sure you give money to avoid poverty for children. But I think this is going to improve both of those things, both those areas.
Right on. Well, Max, we're pretty much at time. Were there any other call outs or observations you wanted to make before we wrap up? It's always such a pleasure to have you on. I love looking at the data together. It's super refreshing.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me again. It was awesome. I would just add that we are sort of transitioning our focus a little bit. We'll still be doing a lot of sort of these papers and analyses, but we've really found some success in empowering people by creating tools. So understanding the effect of UBI, giving people more flexibility to experiment with policy designs and seeing what the effect is. So if you have ideas on that, love to hear it. My email address is max@ubicenter.org. And in general, you can just expect more of those. So all of the interactives you saw here, that's really just the beginning of ways we want to help advocates, policymakers, and the public at large understand the impact in a more immersive way.
Elizabeth says, and Lucky Monster, we're very appreciative of your time. You know, you have that UBI calculator thing. Should we take a look at that before we go?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, let me just show that. So this is, it's linked to from the ubicenter.org website. So what's going on here? What should I do?
Yeah, so this is the basic income builder. This is a way to basically raise revenue through tax or benefit reform or both. And the revenue is automatically recycled into a UBI. So for example, you know, if we just wanted to have a 1% flat income tax and see what kind of UBI that would create, what the impact would be, you can just drag that over. Yeah, 1-2%, I think, like. And it now tells us, okay, that'll fund a monthly UBI of $29. It'll leave about 2/3 of people better off, and it's going to make a pretty big dent in poverty as well.
There's no VAT option here, huh?
Working on it, yeah.
All right, so let's say if I want to channel my inner former Republican, I'm going to say we're just going to have it for adult citizens and we'll have it funded at the federal level. And if you want to channel your inner libertarian, you may remove other types of benefits. And then you say, well, let's fund it with a whatever, 10%. So this is, when we say 10%, are we saying we increase the marginal rates by 10 percentage points? Or how do we interpret that?
Yeah, so imagine there's a new tax that sort of adds on top the existing tax structure, which is just a 10% flat tax on income. That's what this would be.
And then so here you get $400 a month. Now, if you put back the food stamps and you leave SNAP alone, should that recalculate?
I think it did.
Did it? It did, but barely. Oh, so that's so interesting. It went from 421 to 411. So that's super interesting how psychologically you think, wow, food stamp program, that must be so much. Let's get rid of that and just give cash. But it's like only $10 a month difference.
Yes. And it turns out that if you scroll down, you can see the poverty impact. So, you know, this would it would cut poverty by 1/3.
Yeah.
Lots of different age groups here and things like that. But one of the things that I think we have a video, it might be on TikTok. I think we're working on putting it on our first TikTok video. Sort of goes through this and shows that these benefit programs, it's true that reducing them, repealing them would increase poverty. But if you just have a small UBI from a small income tax reform, you can more than offset that reduction or that increase in poverty really easily.
That's amazing. If we all paid another, say, 7 percentage points more in our marginal income tax rate, we could reduce poverty by a quarter. That how
That's right.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it never ceases to amaze me how we can talk and watch people give speeches about how we want to reduce poverty, and like we totally have it within our hands to do that. Like
Absolutely.
pay 7 percentage points more, and 1 out of 4 people who are in poverty will stop being in poverty.
Yeah, that's 10 million people.
Yeah.
So
That's
and actually,
probably...
we don't have to wait for federal action too, because I think there's a lot of ways that states, local governments can do this. So if you go, the tool in the left corner, it does let you select a state, and you can do those reforms at the state level as well to see how it impact.
Love it.
Yeah.
Super cool, Max. Always a pleasure, my friend. We definitely will need to get you back on again. I think it's easy with Andrew, sort of getting ready for his next act, for us to lose a little bit of steam. But the reality is, like, the power is in our hands to provide an economic floor and to really eradicate poverty. And it isn't tied to one campaign or one election. It's something that we all can do. And so hopefully, let's see if we can support things like Congressperson Omar's proposal, these new pilots, and kind of continuing that move, which we're already seeing the tanker shift a little bit to be more open to direct cash relief and with the child tax credit stuff. So maybe that's the crack in the door that we got to run through.
I think so.
All right. Well, with that, we'll say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds.